Hi everyone, welcome to the Movie Section Show. My name is Fariba, and yes, I have finally watched The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. And this is considering the fact that for the last few months, I've been talking excessively about this movie. I've been reacting and watching trailers, I've been doing breakdown videos about it, and now after all these months, I finally got to watch it, and I am so excited to give you my review on the movie. Now, before I get right down into my review, I do want to explain how I'm going to set up my review, and that is I'm going to keep it down to just non-spoilers at the moment because the movie has just come out in theaters this past weekend, and a lot of people have not actually read the book, so I do want to give, some people a chance to actually go and check out the movie for themselves before I even go down into spoiler territory. So just non-spoilers at the moment, but I do intend to do a separate video where I can actually talk about the spoiler context, such as the actual storytelling, the execution, as well as doing a comparison between the movie and the actual book. So do keep an eye on that. But yeah, having now said all of that, I do want to get right down to my review. Now, having said everything that I had to say, right? Overall, having now watched this movie, I will say this. I liked the movie, but I did not love it. And I have to emphasize this. I liked the prequel movie, but I did not love it. And there's one major reason why I was not fully in love with this movie. And that is all comes down to is the execution of its storytelling and recreating that story from the novel. So as you all know, I have actually read the prequel book a long time ago. I've been discussing a lot about it. And, in terms of the actual novel, the prequel novel, it's not the most perfect book. I mean, it's not the best Hunger Games book in the actual series. I mean, there's no denying that. I mean, there is definitely some flaws when it comes to the structure of its storytelling, especially when you get to that third act. That third act has some of its shortcomings. But one of the most fascinating things about the actual story itself and what it really dives down into is the actual character study of Coriolanus Snow and his origin story. I think that that's honestly the most, impressive thing about it. And that is how it really kind of dives really deep into his psychology, into his mindset, what's going on in the moment. It really, because of this first person perspective storytelling, that we really get a much better idea of who Coriolanus Snow is in terms of his mindset, kind of breaking down what he's thinking, what's going on, what his overview is during these times, whether it be in the Capitol or in the Hunger Games or being a mentor in the Hunger Games. And I think that once you start to really read a lot about his own thoughts, you start to get a better idea of how he becomes this transformed, tyrant that we would eventually know from the original Hunger Games. So yeah, the structure of the storytelling is not the greatest, but the actual, arc of who Snow is and learning a bit more about him is the most fascinating thing about it. Now, having said that, right, having now watched the movie itself, this was something that I was hoping that the actual movie would be able to recreate. And unfortunately, that was definitely one of the weakest point of this movie. And that is, of course, the whole storytelling and the whole execution of recreating that story. So the biggest problem that I really started to immediately, notice is that the story itself and just putting in together all the details, right? It definitely lacks the substance. And what I mean by this is that, yeah, the actual movie does break down the big plot points from the novel. There's no denying that. I think that's definitely a very important thing. But it doesn't have the depth of understanding the characters, what their motives are, seeing that connection, that chemistry between the characters. I felt like because the movie was so focused on trying to get through every big event from the novel, that it missed the opportunity to go dive into the depths of what's going on with the characters and their chemistry and all that sort of stuff. So it was basically lacking that substance. And as a result of that, you do get a sense of how the story itself starts to feel really rushed. This is something that I especially felt in that first act. I mean, this movie is divided into 3 acts, and the first act was really the one where I was just hoping that they can really perfect what was going on with not just giving us this whole background of who Corlin Snow is, but developing this relationship between Snow and Lucy Gray, that I feel like it definitely kind of felt flat. And a lot of that's because it is being very rushed. So because of that, the depth of the story was pretty lacking. And yeah, we do kind of get this setup of, this relationship between Snow and Lucy Gray, but it doesn't reach the level of its depthness that we do get from the novel, where the novel really goes so deep into the actual, breakdown of the relationship, to the point where we start to really empathize with Snow and start to realize that, wow, I mean, as much as the fact that this guy is going to become this merciless, ruthless, leader of Pan Am, there's a human side to him. And I feel like that was missing in this movie. So as a result of that, I felt like the actual storytelling kind of felt flat in terms of providing that substance needed to kind of break down that backstory as well as that relationship. Now, having said that, right, I mean, yeah, the whole storytelling could have been better. I wish they could have dedicated a bit more time to it. This is where I would actually say that for a movie like this, right, the length of the actual movie is already at 2 hours, I think 38 minutes. And even though the movie itself is already long, I feel like it really needed another 20 to maybe 25 minutes to actually kind of break down a lot of that deep story that the novel itself does a really great job of. So as a result of that, that was probably where I was kind of a bit pet peeved about, just because, there was this really great storytelling of Snow that, this movie could have had the potential to, break down, to really kind of focus on, and it just missed that. So that was just the one area that I felt like, this movie could have done so much better. But that's not to say that, of course, I totally hate this movie. There are definitely some redeeming qualities about it. But before I even get down to it, I do want to kind of explain a little bit about, the fact that in terms of storytelling, that there are a lot of differences between the book and the actual movie. So this is something I really have to emphasize, because when it comes to the Hunger Games, right, and just about any time when we do have any story where have these adaptations, there are cases where movie adaptations take quite the creative liberties on how they want to approach a story, especially if it's coming from a novel. There are cases where some movies take quite a huge drift into how they want to portray the story and kind of start to divert from the actual novel itself and the original content. But when it comes to the Hunger Games, or at least the original Hunger Games, for the most part, they've pretty been, they've gone, in terms of just executing the story and recreating the plot points from the actual books, they do a pretty good job of, of being faithful to the actual content, the specific details about it. And so, for those movies, right, I mean, they've been pretty on point with the novels, especially all the big details. And Catching Fire is definitely the best case where, they really do a great job of recreating the content from the novel. And it makes sense. Catching Fire is the best novel in the Hunger Games series, and therefore the movie is also just as equally the best one in the whole movie franchise. So, but when it comes to Ballad, Songbirds, and Snakes, and, kind of getting this impression from the trailers how, a lot of the story is going to be very on point with the novel, I was very surprised to see how much they changed a lot of some of the narrative devices, or not just narrative devices, but a lot of the specific details of what happens in the games, what happens with Snow, what happens in that final act, that I feel like I do need to address. So what I want to do say is that there are definitely some things that they do change that are, some really good changes. And then there's some changes that I wish they didn't really change. So I'm going to try and keep this as vague as possible, of course. But in terms of the things that they do change that I wasn't a big fan of, is specifically the big details of the 10th Hunger Games. Those are definitely some of the biggest changes regarding, what happens to the tribute as well as the results of it. And I mean, yeah, I think I can understand why they make some of those creative, changes, because you have to do a 2 hour and 36-minute movie. But I wish they did not change that. There was a couple of cases where I was just like, wow, I'm so excited to see this particular part be recreated onto the big screen, only to see that it didn't really happen. And it's like, well, it kind of feels a bit anticlimactic in some cases, or that it doesn't really unleash that whole adrenaline that I felt from the books that I would love to feel in the movie. So those are some of the few cases where I was just like, man, I wish they could have just stuck to the book and like the details of it and just would have just recreated that. But even that being the case, there are some areas where the actual movie itself does a really good job of making some changes. I think a couple cases would be, of course, one being the third act. Like I've mentioned before, the third act is the one area that I was very concerned about, because the third act is quite long. It's quite bland at some cases, and it's a tough one to get through because it's like a whole reset of telling a story after having gone through a whole adrenaline rush of the 10th Hunger Games, only to kind of jump into the story and have like still a whole like 30-45 minutes left of storytelling that you're just kind of like, why do we still have more, story to get through? And of course, it makes sense when we get to the end, but it's a rough one to kind of get back into. So at least in terms of executing that third act, that final act, I think they do a pretty good job of condensing that down so that you can only just focus on the relevant bits. There is one aspect, again, that I wish they could have, been a bit more concentrated on to kind of emphasize a little bit more what was going on with Snow and explain a little bit of what ends up transpiring and, leads to the ending of the movie. But for the most part, the third act was much better than I expected. So that's one good thing. Another one I would say is the fact that they actually elevated a lot of, some of the characters. So Dean Cascott Highbottom, I noticed, had a much greater presence in this movie, and it really works out in a big way. Another character was Lucky Flickerman. He doesn't really talk a lot in the actual books, but he actually has a much bigger presence in the actual movie, like during the 10th Hunger Games sequences. And he definitely had some pretty, some great moments in the movie that are definitely some standouts. So some good places here and there in terms of the changes, but again, some areas I wish they could have kept, but also others, good job. So now, having like addressed some of my criticisms and things I wish they could have just kept, it doesn't mean that I totally hate this movie. I liked it, and here are the reasons why. One, of course, is the world building. I mean, when it comes to looking at the world of Panem, especially in a time where it's like 64 years before the events of, Katniss Everdeen going into her own first game, like the world building of Panem is absolutely just gorgeous, beautiful. It really reminds you of what Panem looks like had it been like post-war. Like it really reminisces like a lot of the images that we would see of like post-World War II, like the post-World War II world, and how, a lot of cities, a lot of countries are trying to rehabilitate from the effects of the war. And you can get that sense of that whole essence, that whole setting from this movie. Like, and let me just say this, when it comes to like visual effects and, the visuals alone and cinematography, like that is not to say the original Hunger Games never really had that. I will say that there are a couple cases where the CGI could have improved, especially in the first movie. Like there's one scene in the first movie where they're having that not victory parade, but they're having that parade where all the 12 districts are, are showcasing themselves to everyone in the crowd. And, you can see how Katniss and Peter are in their carts, and there's fire coming from their suits because that's the whole, effect of it. But you can tell just from like looking from the screen that, the CGI does not look so complete. This one, it feels like everything was very complete. Everything was very polished. Everything was completed to the way that, it makes the world so immense. So that's one thing I have to say. The world building in this movie is so incredible. It's quite a contrast from what we see in the original Hunger Games, and it shows like how much the games have changed from that point, from this point to that point. So that was one thing I have to compliment. I mean, the world building is absolutely just gorgeous, amazing, fantastic work right there. Another thing I want to say, of course, is just the depths of the violence and the brutality of what we see in this movie. Like, it's not to say that the original Hunger Games were not already violent and brutal enough. I mean, just the whole idea of 24 kids having to be reaped into a game. I mean, that alone is a very, shocking idea for anyone to ever experience. But this one really took it up a notch. I mean, to a point where it was kind of hitting borderline to maybe even hitting R rating. But that is not to say that, it's not as effective. It's very effective. I mean, this movie is very, brutal, very dark in some of the executions. There are definitely areas where I was completely shocked how dark the actual moment was. I mean, there's one in the third act that it just was really chilling, like far more suspenseful than I actually felt with, some of the latter parts of the Hunger Games, like in Mockingjay. Like, I mean, that's something that I have to say, like, it really shows the essence of how dark this period is. How, there's going to be this huge shift. And again, it's a kind of like a really, good way, not good way, but it's a really, interesting way of showing this huge shift of this game. And it really emphasizes what's going on in the moment because of the fact that, they're making some major changes to the game that you can see how there's this profound effect and significance of how things have, been far more consequential as a result of what happened with all these changes. So, I gotta say, like, the brutality, the violence, it's far more than what we saw in the original Hunger Games. So that's one thing I think it really works into its whole effect, showing how, again, these games are and how much they have changed. And that becomes very clear when you watch this movie in the prequel, where, again, it's just so brutal, it's so tragic. I mean, it's so gory. I mean, not want to say gory, but definitely brutal in its effect, far more than the original movie. So that was one other thing that I was like, wow, they really took it up a notch when it comes to the actual brutality. And of course, like, the best thing about this movie, without a doubt, is the performances. Holy cow, can I say the performance here everyone's just giving their masterclass performance here, like even more so than I ever felt with the original movies. I mean, this is a cast where you already know you have some big names. You have Viola Davis, you have Peter Dinklage, and it's like, okay, I mean, how far can you go? And wow, the performances are really the most redeeming thing about this movie. And it really kind of, having now mentioned a little bit about, the issues about the actual storytelling, the execution of it, the redeeming part, of course, is going to be the performance. And here's why, right? I mean, you have Viola Davis playing Dr. Volumia Gold. She plays this, sinister mad scientist who can be very creepy. And anytime she ends up on the big screen, anytime we're actually ever, countering her, I mean, she's giving quite an amazing performance. I mean, it's a performance that you've never seen her ever before. And it's so effective and so, like, chilling that you're just like, man, I want to see more of her. And I think the only mistake of, this whole movie when it comes to Dr. Gold is that we didn't get to see more of her. And that I'm pretty sure there was far more sequences between her and Snow. So I wish there could have been more of Dr. Gold just to see, again, how her, presence has a big effect on Snow. But again, Viola Davis as Gold, amazing. And then you have Peter Dinklage as Dean Casca Highbottom. I just mentioned earlier before how he has a much greater presence in this movie than he does in the book, which is a big thing. I mean, it really emphasizes this whole, relationship between Snow and Dean Casca Highbottom because, Dean is a foil to Snow. There is a reason why to it. They explain this in the movie. But yeah, the fact that he has a much elevated role, it really kind of shows kind of this mystery about who this character is. Like, you think you know who he is just from the beginning, only to see that there's a lot more going on behind his mindset that we eventually start to break down as we get closer and closer to the movie. And just seeing Peter Dinklage's role as the character, even in a sense that he is a supporting cast, I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. Anytime I saw Peter Dinklage, I was like, wow, he's really giving it his all with this character. I mean, it's so effortless. It's so remarkable that I was just like, wow, this is one, great thing that I got to see from this movie that even the books never really got to the depths of. So another great thing about that. Of course, I want to talk about the leads. So let's talk about Rachel Zegler, who plays Lucy Gray Baird in this movie. And let me just say, like, I've seen a lot of her movies before. I've seen her in West Side Story, and I think she was great in that. I wasn't sure if that was going to kind of be like, a one-time thing though, of course. So, like, a lot of big questions about that. And then, of course, she did show up in Shazam 2, but she didn't really have quite a presence in that movie. So it's just like, okay, can she really showcase herself as, a very promising actor in a movie like Ballad of Songbirds Snakes? And that is not to say that I wasn't already, confident about her. Like, the fact that they did cast her, like, I had a good feeling about it just because she has that musical background, which was very necessary for a character like Lucy Gray, who has that musical, background. And then it's like a matter of how can she really execute Lucy and get her, peculiarity, her quirkiness. And overall, despite like kind of my, my qualms about her accent, I have to say overall, her performance is absolutely spectacular. I was absolutely just memorized. I was mesmerized by her performance in this film. Like, you get the sense of her quirkiness, you get the sense of her, Dolly Parton sort of energy that you see her throughout the movie. Richard Zegler is never too over the top, or never does she ever feel like she's underwhelming. She has a right balance of who Lucy Gray is in this movie in a way that, it's really reminiscent to the character that we see, that I got to read in the book. I think she does quite a fantastic job. I mean, her performance is definitely one of the standouts here, and it really works out very well. So definitely gotta say, Richard Zegler is one of the best things about this movie, without a doubt. Her performance is just one to keep an eye on. Of course, I do want to address Tom Blyth, because when it comes to an actor like him, I mean, when you look at his resume, he doesn't have quite a lot of big projects. I think his biggest before Hunger Games was probably Billy the Kid. But aside from that, this is his biggest role ever. And this is considering the fact that he is playing a character who has previously been played by another actor, by Donald Sutherland. And he does quite a remarkable job of really showing this villainous side of who Coriolanus Snow is, or President Snow is, in the original Hunger Games. So for an actor like Tom Blyth, where, this movie is basically his biggest break, I mean, he has a lot of shoes to fill in, in comparison to Donald Sutherland. And even that being the case, even the fact that there are going to be this huge challenge right there, I mean, Tom Blyth, overall, he does quite a remarkable job of showing this layered character, showing this evolution of Coriolanus Snow, this young Coriolanus Snow that we meet, to a point where a lot of us are still feeling pretty empathetic to him, where in a sense we're rooting for him, right? I mean, this is how I felt like in the novels, and Tom Blyth does a really great job of really, recreating that essence in the movie. And this is, again, considering the fact that, I mentioned earlier how the movie was missing that depth, missing the substance of, Snow's mindset, how he's feeling in the moment, the setting of it, as well as this, this evolving relationship between Snow and Lucy Gray. Even the fact that the actual execution was missing in this film, this is redeemed by Tom Blyth's performance. And as I said before, right? I mean, when we look into a character like Coriolanus Snow, right? I mean, we've seen stories how they are heroes' journeys. But if this is a movie that is really focused on the villain's journey, and Tom Blyth does just such an incredible job showing how much Coriolanus Snow changes from the beginning to the end, how he evolves, how he transforms, what are the triggering points, how he starts to really change as he starts to mature. And we see that maturity happen gradually throughout the film without feeling so spontaneous. And again, you have to really give a lot of credit to Tom Blyth for really showing that layered, powerful performance from beginning to end, especially in that ending. I mean, that ending where, we get to see, Corio and how he has that, that shocking moment happen to him. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, he really nails this role. I mean, he is what really puts this movie together. He's the glue for this. He's the redeeming factor for this film. I mean, I cannot wait to see what more that Tom Blyth does in the future, because, wow, he does quite a remarkable job of playing a youthful Coriolanus Snow in this movie. So props to him. Yeah, like, having mentioned all of that, of course, like, as I said before, I think had the movie had actually, reworked its execution and actually gone through the depths of the actual storytelling to the point where it will allow the beginning of the stuff to kind of address a lot of the romance between Snow and Lucy, that it would have allowed the actual ending to feel far more profound. Like, while that was a missing aspect, it doesn't, take away the fact that this movie has some really great things going on with it. The visual, the cinematography, the performances, I mean, the brutality of the actual 10th Hunger Games. I mean, those are the moments that really kind of shine as well. And so, yeah, even with the ending itself, like, I have to say, like, I do need to emphasize the ending. The ending is basically on point with the actual novel itself too. Like, even though I had some issues in the beginning, the ending really works out well. It really meets expectations I had with the actual book. I mean, the ending, like, aside from like a few, tweaks and changes that they make in the actual ending, it's really on point with what happens in the novel. And not just that, but you can really get the sense of the sheer, betrayal that you get when you see, Snow, and how he really starts to feel in the moment. Like, I mean, it's some really powerful stuff. So yeah, I mean, as a result of that, I mean, overall, I did enjoy this movie. I mean, as I said, I liked it. I just wish that they could have taken a bit more time to dedicate a little bit of that storytelling, so that way it could have been a bit more structured. It could have been a bit more deep, so that the actual after effects and the consequences of it could have felt a bit more significant. But that's not to say that this movie is not worth seeing. I do recommend seeing it, of course, if you, of course, having not read the actual book. But yeah, that's all to say about The Hunger Games: The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I mean, again, I liked it. I just did not love it, but that's not to say that this is a really good addition to the Hunger Games franchise. If you were to ask me how I would actually rank this amongst the other Hunger Games movies, I would say that I think it definitely beats out Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2. Without a doubt. I mean, those are the movies I really have a tough time getting through, so easily beat those two. In terms of the first Hunger Games and Catching Fire, I don't think it's gonna beat Catching Fire. I think Catching Fire is still the best, without a doubt. I mean, there's a reason why it's the best. So it's still at the top. It still reigns supreme. I think The Hunger Games, the first one, is still slightly better just because it's far more in tune with the actual material. So I would say it would be Catching Fire, then the first Hunger Games, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Mockingjay Part 2, and Mockingjay Part 1. So that's all I have to say about The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I've given you my review about it, but I want to hear from you guys. If you're someone who has watched the movie and read the books, what are your thoughts about just the material of it all? Like, did you enjoy some of the changes, or do you think it had some similar issues that I had with it? Do you think there were some shortcomings, or did you fully enjoy it far more than I did? So let me know. If you have watched it but have not read the books, what do you think about it overall? Did you enjoy it? Are there some things that you feel like you were a bit confused about? I know I had a friend who was with me, and there were some areas that I had to explain to her, but were you a bit more, were you a bit more flexible on understanding what was going on in the moment, or were there some things that you wish the movie could have taken a bit more, time to kind of explore? What do you think about, the actual movie overall? And concerning in terms of how you feel about this movie in terms of the actual Hunger Games universe, like, where would you rank it? Would it be better than the other movies? Would it be better in between? Let me know your thoughts about that. And as I said before, I'm going to do a spoiler video about this and discussing some of the things about it. So if you have anything that you want me to address in that spoiler video, let me know your questions in the comments down below. So yeah, let me know your comments down below, and make sure to like and subscribe.